Welcome to the Saturday Salon. I'm so excited that it is Saturday again. This show has been going for weekly for 6+ years, and it has mainly been an informal space for the young global leaders. But we are opening it up for the wider audience. We discuss so important and very timely matters that should be listened to by everyone. Today, I'm speaking with my good friend, Swapan Mehra. He is the CEO of LoRa Ecological Solutions, and he's tuning in directly and live from India. You just returned from US, Swapan, if I'm not mistaken. Good evening, and it's so nice to see you.
Hey, good evening, Soulaima. Good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here, to see you, Soulaima, and really excited to have this conversation with you, my dear friend, whose vision and passion for sharing knowledge is something that inspires me every time I talk to her and look at her broadcasts. So thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you so much, Swapan. You and I did spend a week together 2 years ago in Silicon Valley. You came and visited me, and we went and had an awesome week with some of the most prominent investors, universities, professors, and whatnot. And I got to learn a little bit more about what you are doing. And if I may be honest, nature is front and center. I think everyone cares about sustainability and the future of the world, but not that many have done what you're doing at that magnitude and level. So I was hoping that today that we could talk a little bit about why we should still care about the nature and why there are still things to be optimistic about. And also, I'm hoping maybe we can disclose a little bit whether AI and machine learning has been a disadvantage or an advantage for some of the work that you're doing to protect nature and the future of the world. But before we dive in, I hope you are doing really well, and it's really nice to see you and that everything worked out because you were just touring US, right? You just spent time in Silicon Valley once again. You went for the Natural Capital Symposium 2026 at Stanford University. And there you met with leaders from governments and also institutions like financial institutions and academics and, of course, private sector leaders. So what's on the agenda, Swapan? What's happening with the environment? Is there still anything to be optimistic about, or are we all doomed?
No. Well, there is still a lot to be optimistic about. I'm always very hopeful, very positive. I really believe that humanity is and will realize the true value of a symbiotic relationship with nature, and we will move our economy in the direction of being a nature-friendly economy. And that's the area that I've spent my working life so far committed on, and that's where I'm committed to working for the rest of many years to come. As the reason why, Soulaima, like you mentioned, I was in the US is that I'm part of this Natural Capital Alliance led by Stanford, where what we are trying to do is trying to see how best we can create tools, modalities, platforms to mainstream nature on the balance sheet of countries and companies. And this is where I'd like to focus on for the initial part of our conversation today. You know, the World Economic Forum came up with a very interesting report a few years ago, which has sort of become a benchmark on valuing nature. And I agree and disagree with it both, and I'll tell you why. The report said that more than 50% of the global GDP, which is about $58 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So come to think of it, the report really got interest and it put nature on the spotlight because it said that 50% of the global GDP does depend on nature. Because you know what has happened since the beginning of the industrial revolution is that we've always just externalized cost of nature. We've not internalized it into our thinking. When we set up a factory and when we pollute water, we don't really count the cost of that polluted water. When we use fresh air, we don't count the cost of that fresh air. When we look at the regulation services of forests towards oceans, we don't put a value to that. So these have all been externalities, and for the first time there was a major organization putting a value and saying half of what you're producing is dependent on nature. But I'll tell you why I disagree with this as well. Why I disagree with this is that the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, estimates that actually nature produces about 140 trillion of value annually, but it's not counted. A lot of services of nature don't make its way into the formal process of GDP accounting. So which is why the World Economics Forum report is based on a biased process where you've only valued very few services. Like timber going into house making is a value from nature, but the carbon sequestered is not counted as a value from nature. Nature truly delivers to us all and every products and services that we depend on. There is nothing that's outside nature. And I think this is the key message that I want to convey today, that Society is a subset of nature and we are part of the society, and economy is smaller than society, not the other way around. So we need to really think about this. Nature is definitely at risk. In the last just 50 years, we've lost 73% of all our wildlife. We've lost more than 80% of all our native forests. We have less than 15 to 20% native forests left. Fisheries are almost every natural fishery is heavily depleted. There is about 2 billion hectares of degraded land around the world. In major countries, land is losing capacity to produce any food. Monsoon flows are off the charts. The Arctic is warming about 4 times faster than what it used to. 70 to 90% of coral reefs will disappear in 20 years. And then the ocean has already risen to by about 2 meters. In places like Greenland, the rise is about 7 meters. Because of the decline in nature, a lot of our global processes that we depend on are also affected. Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the amok cycle on which almost all life depends, is expected to actually shut down by 2100 if we do nothing. The World Bank says that by 2030, if we don't really address the nature crisis, we'll be losing 10% in global GDP every year. There's more. We might lose about 1 million species around the world, which could be future cures for diseases that we don't even know before we even identify them. So nature is at crisis. A lot of nature's processes are threatened, and we really need to act. We really need to act on this. And one of the ways on which my organization is working towards promoting this cause is by looking at least internalizing the value of nature into our thinking. And second is then investing in nature when you recognize the value of nature. And that's sort of our big goal. The picture is not totally bleak. There is movement in this direction. There are new models, new frameworks for reporting. I think many of us here must have heard of the Paris Agreement of the UNFCCC. There is a big nature target there. Then the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which says 30% of all habitats must be saved. Huge amount of efforts done on the corporate front by TNFD, IASB, the sustainability reporting, etc. And because of this, investing in nature is starting to pick up, but it's too little. At the moment, global estimates show that only $200 billion are being spent on restoration of nature every year. And I think about $7.5 trillion on degrading nature every year. We need to kind of flip this, right? The estimate is that we immediately need to start deploying at least $600 billion a year to restore nature if we have to just keep it in balance. The second biggest challenge, and I'll pause here, which is very relevant to the audience here, is that even out of this $200 billion that is being spent right now, only 10% comes from the private sector. The rest is all public money, legacy conventional policies. So which means that the private sector, which is consuming a lot of nature supplies, which is using a lot of nature's products, is actually not giving back to nature. And that's a big problem that we all need to think about addressing.
Thank you for really giving us a deep dive into the major problems and also where some of the solutions and bottlenecks are. Maybe we should begin from the end. You said the private sector is only contributing with 10%, even though they are consuming the most. What's the solution? I mean, I'm a private sector person. I have a startup. I have an AI startup. How could I contribute?
Well, two things. One is that we need to look at regenerative business models, right? We obviously can't impose substantial costs on the private sector to the effect that the businesses are not viable. So there are two things. One is we need to, at some extent, internalize the cost of nature in the operations of the private sector, which means that there might be some adjustments in terms of their pricing of products, etc. But the second is, most importantly, we need to promote regenerative business practices. And there are possibilities of several regenerative business practices. Look at agriculture. Regenerative agriculture not only reduces input costs, it actually is more cost effective in the medium to long run. If you shift from high fertilizer agriculture, by the way, fertilizers around the world attract about $500 billion in subsidies, right? So it's not that that's not a cost that societies are not paying. If you shift from high fertilizer to more nature-friendly regenerative farming, you are in a position to improve the quality of land, save biodiversity, save water, potentially increase income of farmer communities, and give back to nature. What does it need? It needs some reallocation in terms of your spending models. It requires new awareness and adoption of new science. The science is already out there. And it also requires us to orient governments and investors to think about why these new business models matter, why they should invest there. Soulaima, you might recall that this is something I was exploring quite a bit when I was with you in the Silicon Valley trip as well, that While there is interest to look at technology-based solutions for climate change, we need to build an equal interest to look at nature-based solutions for climate change. Why are there not enough investors just funding a transition of land-based systems? Those are the models that we need to propagate. The second is that, there are several quarters of industry where if we are able to even internalize 10% of the nature externality, Soulaima, it will not render them in not competitive. It will not render them non-profitable. They can still internalize those values by drawing efficiencies. I want to give you a small example here. Natura and Puma, two companies, pioneers in the area of putting nature on their balance sheet, they did this exercise 10 years ago. A lot of reports from both of these companies now show that when they started putting a cost to their nature externalities, they obviously started looking at ways and means to reduce that cost. And both have now said that in a decade since they've been doing this, they've actually become more profitable because they have now become more efficient in terms of water recycling, reduction in supply chain losses, so on and so forth. So, by essence, what I'm saying is shift to regenerative business models, look at efficiency by reducing your impact on nature. Finally, there are new businesses being created that can attract investments and that can attract entrepreneurs, such as carbon credits, such as biodiversity credits. So there are now opportunities to invest in nature as well. The World Economic Forum, in fact, estimates that by 2030 there could be $10 trillion in value that regenerative, nature-friendly businesses could create if we work collaboratively to really promote them.
But what you also is saying is that you're part of this alliance and many of you are working globally. So would you say that major corporates, supply chains, and all of those mega IT companies and governments, for instance, in India and others, are actually focused on this? Could we go so far and say that things are happening, or is it very much still on the drawing board and still in the meeting rooms and not totally being implemented, even though you did mention companies who do something practical and very realistically and practical? But how many are actually doing to that extent that you are suggesting that you could do, putting nature on the balance sheet?
Not enough, not enough. I think the models exist, the technology exists, but not enough. Not enough companies are doing what needs to be done. And I believe that is a factor, one of, I would say, lack of awareness of these new models, Sulema, because I truly feel that, we worked with the Michigan State University to actually develop a portal called Banking on Nature, for which we interviewed 50 leading investors from around the world, asset managers and investors. And we actually realized that based on we interviewed them on what's restricting them from investing in nature. The wide majority responded that the key issue was lack of awareness and ability to actually understand how to invest. So I think that's a gap that we need to fulfill. The second is, look, we do need more political drive, right? I think, in fact, off late in a lot of countries, we are heading backwards, which is sad. We do need a lot of a renewed political drive towards mainstreaming these models, because while there is a lot of voluntary action by companies, while some companies have strategically started identifying the risk of not investing in nature, so they are, because they've understood that their supply chains are threatened. But if we want industry as a whole to act on this as quickly as we need it to, it'll require policy. It'll require policy shift. It'll require mandating some things such as putting nature on a balance sheet. That, I think, needs to happen faster. I do think countries are acting on nature. I do think countries are trying to fulfill their goals of CBD and UNFCCC, but I think that more can be done there for sure.
I mean, your organization is active in many countries, not only India. And we will come back to discuss India because I think a lot of people are curious about what is India doing, what is China doing, because in the great scheme of the world, it matters what China and India is doing, right? Exactly because of your size and also because the amount of production that's going on, both in China and also in India. And so much supply chain productivity is actually in those locations. But tell me a little bit about what is happening around the world and what is your footprint currently? Because I can see that you have helped mobilize more than $10 billion in public environmental finance. And you also have worked on conserving more than 10 million hectares of forest and much more. So you've done a lot, but not only in India, but actually quite a fact in global. So what's happening, let's say, in Southeast Asia, Africa, and so forth? What is happening?
Yeah, definitely. Sulema, we are active in various parts of the world. In Africa, currently, our biggest initiative is partnering with the AFR 100, which is the Africa 100 coalition, whose goal is to restore 100 million hectares in Africa. I'm in fact headed next week to Madagascar for their annual summit, where our teams, we have teams that are working on actually creating investable nature-based solution projects and then working with large investors to close those investments, both public sector and private sector. So we are going to be working with 7 African nations on creating a portfolio of initially about 2 million hectares of investable restoration and regeneration projects, and then trying to see how we can close investments in those using a combination of DFI, African Development Bank kind of sources, and then large private investors. Interestingly, majorly from Japan, there's a lot of interest from Japanese investors to invest in nature restoration in Asia and Africa. Now we've just closed a deal with one major Japanese investor for an Indian project. So that's something that we're doing. Africa is interesting. Africa has both a huge push on extraction of natural resources, of course, because they are on a trajectory of growth that many countries were many years ago. But at the same time, because their economic expansion is happening at a time when they see the environmental nature crisis, there is a huge amount of interest from their political leaders on restoration. You've heard of the Great Green Wall in Sahel. You've heard of initiatives in each one of these countries. I think a big problem there is capital. There isn't just enough capital to invest in nature, and there is this tension between attracting capital for extraction versus extracting capital for restoration. Many African countries, at least on the climate front, are very progressive in terms of their policies. They've done a lot to, in the climate space, you have carbon credits which go through the UN system. They're called Article 6 credits. African countries were amongst the first to pass really comprehensive, like Kenya has one of the best policies in the world related to Article 6. So so we see a huge possibility and a huge interest there of dovetailing what we call economic development with green growth. So kind of advising these countries on a green economic development strategy so that they don't have to go all the way where other countries went and come back, but how they can dovetail green growth into their economy, how they can restore these lands but grow energy crops and not depend entirely on fossil fuel, and grow regenerative medicines, and create an export of medical produce, etc. So those models. We are active in Southeast Asia. We are working currently in Philippines and Indonesia. We've also worked in the past in Malaysia. Indonesia and Malaysia, we worked actually on with some fairly large companies who were in the palm oil business, trying to see how we can reverse some of the effects of palm oil. That's been a big challenge there. In Philippines, we are working on a very large restoration program on Negros Island. The challenges are so interesting and so varying, but also so similar across all of our countries, right? Like in Philippines, our biggest challenge has been land tenure, because there are about 5 different categories of land tenure. And doing a restoration project, Soulaima, means that we are going to have a relationship with the landowner for at least 30 years. Nature-based solutions give you a carbon removal with a permanence period of 30 to 40 years. They were designed like that. The idea was that we start now and you get a buffer till 2050, 2060, 2070, which is when most of the countries have their net zero targets and they start decarbonizing. So that's how these are designed. So that's something we're struggling with. In South America, we are working a lot in Colombia and Brazil. In Colombia, very encouraging and very interesting as well. Colombia has vast tracts of land which used to be cattle ranches but are now degraded and now available for restoration. And the government is trying to come up with very proactive policies. In fact, there is a huge amount of opportunity in Colombia for all of you here to actually acquire land and turn it into forests and leave it for your future generations. So I invite anybody who's interested to come talk to us. So a lot happening around the world. I would say that while this on the investment side, on the model side, a lot is being done. I think on the policy side, while the UN is moving forward, individual countries are moving forward at a different pace. I think that there is a need to somehow bring them all together. So one other effort that we are working on is also, with some YGLs, by the way, in Brazil. I've been discussing this idea of creating a global South coalition on nature investment, and with some YGLs in Africa. So, I hope some of those are on this call, but to see how we can create this coalition to actually get our countries to have an even stance on nature investments and restrictions on non-nature investments. So let's see how that goes.
Well, you brought it up yourself. First and foremost, thank you for everything you're doing. It's incredible and very visionary. And it's also a long-term commitment. You've been doing this for more than 10 years now. So this is probably something that you have to work on the next 20 years to see this follow through. But can carbon markets, can they actually be trusted, Swapan? I mean, can they be trusted?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very important question, because for many of us who started working in this space many years ago and globally advocated and lobbied for environmental markets, I was one of those people who's worked with the Norwegian NORAD in their early deals and the UNFCCC, etc., etc. We counted carbon markets as a big achievement, right? That now finally there is this global mechanism to price an ecosystem asset. I still believe that that market has a lot of virtue and a lot of value. I do understand that there have been instances of that market going wrong and of the market being misused, especially on the nature-based solution side, by developers, by traders, and that's highly unfortunate. I think that's very unfortunate. And but I do feel that we don't need to throw the baby with the bathwater, right? I mean, look, there was a crisis in the United States on real estate, right, in which there were financial instruments that were misused and billions were lost. Neither did we shut down real estate investing, by the way, nor did we shut down those derivative instruments. We still continue to do both. I think when you're creating a new market, there will be instances and there will be learning. I know it's very unfortunate that when somebody raises investments for the right cause, for the cause of nature and communities, and it gets misused, it's very hard and it's very disheartening, but I don't think we should do that. So I think there are a few things that are in play now which can improve all of this. One, higher awareness amongst investors and higher awareness among standards. All the standards are trying to put in place greater safeguards. Two, I am part of the expert advisory group on the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. There is VCMI, there is also the ICVCM. We are all trying to come up with different codes of conduct and practices so that investors and project developers have more integrity. The third thing is technology. And Soulaima, this is where I also want to come to your AI question. While the footprint of AI is going to be huge on nature, I mean, now we are seeing that. I just read this news yesterday that almost every big tech company who had a net zero target is now revisiting the net zero target, because when they set these targets 5 years ago, they had not envisioned that their emissions are going to be almost equal to countries now with the data centers, right? Also, we talk a lot about emissions. We also need to talk about water. Their impact on water is very, very high. Like in many parts of the world now, they are competing with communities for water. So I really think we need to have like a separate conversation on nature regenerative data centers. But while AI imposes costs on nature, it also offers solutions. There are models being built by several organizations on higher accuracy in assessing the development of nature-based solutions so that there is no greenwashing. We have a model that we built with Michigan State University, a machine learning model that can count in a landscape across millions of hectares each and every tree and give you like the growth of the tree, the carbon stock in the tree, even the fruits in the tree. So, there are many others doing this. So I think that technology has a role to play. So I feel that the carbon market still can deliver a lot of benefits. I do feel that we need to educate the investors a lot more in what matters, what to check, and we need to put in place many more safeguards. And I feel that in many countries now, with regulated markets coming up, we might be able to solve this problem, because in the voluntary market, it's very hard to enforce. But at the end of all of this, the joy of doing a good nature-based community carbon projects is unrivaled. We have a project in Meghalaya in the northeast of India. We are working with 18,000 farmers. We've done about 26,000 hectares of restoration. And by the way, this is a part of the world where most of the land is owned by women. It's a matrilineal society. It gives me great joy whenever we visit there and meet one of these women farmers. One is called Milda, one is called Annie, and who we planted with and who are now seeing 95, 98% survival over years, whose land is better, whose water table has improved, whose income has improved. I think the benefit that you're giving to communities and the world is unrivaled with nature-based solutions. I think I would arguably say that the co-benefits are higher than technology-based solutions. So we can't abandon this. We need to get behind carbon markets, and we need to add more and more other markets to this mix.
Well, it's a little off the record question, I would say, but I'm part of the Future Council for the World Economic Forum as part of the Faith in Action. And we mainly work on three things, advising the WEF on three things. It's AI, moral economy, and sustainability. And to my it's not a surprise, but what really have been moving the needle in terms of coming up with more sustainable farming, let's say, right, is actually by communicating globally through faith communities. Think about it, Swapan. 80% of everyone has some sort of faith, right? Muslim, Hindu, Christian, you name it, right? So if you talk through the faith communities, it has actually proven that that has a very high impact in terms of not negotiating, but communicating the reason and the logic behind maybe more ecological ways of farming and protecting nature. Does this resonate with you at all?
It's very interesting, Soulaima, you say this. So in Stanford, the professor who heads this Natural Capital Alliance, she and I were having a conversation over breakfast, and we were discussing that. I was saying that, her name is Gretchen. I was saying, Gretchen, it seems to me that while we are pushing forward this whole agenda of mainstreaming nature and economics, it's going too slow. Maybe we should talk about how we can reach people's hearts more rather than their minds through economics, right? You know what she said? She said that, Swapan, I've been doing conservation since the 70s, 80s, from the days of the Silent Spring, Rachel Carson. She said, we all started out feeling that we can influence the heart and we kind of failed, so we moved to the mind. I don't know, Sulema. So we were discussing that now maybe is a good time for us to do both, right? How do you have something like what you're saying? How do you have regenerative models? Because it's one thing to just go tell people, hey, let's save the world, but without a menu of solutions, it doesn't work. So now that we have that menu of solutions, how do we combine these two things and use faith? I completely agree with you. We had a discussion that we should do a convening of all religious leaders at Stanford. And Sulema, maybe that's another reason for me to come back and work with you on this. But we discussed that we must combine these two and we must use faith as a means of communicating, but communicating the right economic models that communities can work on. I do feel that those two need to come together because unless governments mandate all of this, the only other way to reach the masses is faith. So I think there is something there. But it's interesting also that there has been a faith coalition working with the UNFCCC for many, many years. And Sulema, I think it's also worth discussing why it hasn't had the impact at the scale that we thought it could. And maybe there's something that maybe it is because there is a clear separation between the mind and heart right now, and we need to bring them together.
Yeah, but let's just give an example. If the Pope says something about ecological farming, there are a few people there that will listen, right? And so it's just interesting.
Absolutely.
And 2 years ago, during the Climate Week, I was lucky enough to co-host 100 of the most influential faith leaders in the world in a room with no media for 1 day and a half, and to discuss exactly, for instance, climate and sustainability. Anyway, it was a little side question, but I just thought it would be interesting to hear what you had to say with that. But let's just talk a little bit about biodiversity. You said it yourself, a lot of the solutions to the disease that we are facing now and those we will in the future, actually the solutions are in the nature. They are to be found in the nature. But because of the quality of the seawater, the forests are shrinking massively and so forth, we might never really find the solutions, the medicines and the knowledge that are hidden in the nature because it will simply be gone by then. So how can we actually make biodiversity investable? And I'm honestly very interested in what you have to say because I've now spent 10 years in Silicon Valley, the heart of investing, and where all the most prominent funds and private equity firms have at least, if not headquartered, then at least an office. And I have not heard a lot about biodiversity as something being investable. Maybe in a roundtable discussion at Berkeley once, maybe twice at Stanford, but that's pretty much it. So how do we bring that agenda front and center? And how do we make sure that VCs have a certain model. You know that, Swapan. They want 100x, they want return and all that. And you can prove that those companies who actually put nature on the balance sheet is actually more profitable. So how do we get that conversation going?
So first and foremost, I'm going to talk a little bit about a new emerging instrument called biodiversity credits. So I'm on the governing board of the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, and I'm co-leading a group right now, which is within that, which is writing a new standard on additionality for biodiversity credits. So biodiversity credits is an emerging market. There are several countries which already have regulated instruments around biodiversity credits. Actually, the US is a pioneer in this. Wetland banking, wetland mitigation banking is sort of one of the more examples of biodiversity credits. But the idea now is to mainstream this around the world. So what happens in biodiversity credits is that several large corporates nowadays have a biodiversity no net loss target. And the idea is to promote many more of them to have a no net loss target, either voluntarily or by helping them assess risk to their operations by biodiversity loss. Some of the largest FMCG companies in the world are now realizing that if they don't save pollinators in the areas from where they're buying coffee or where they're buying other plants, in 10 years, they will have no coffee. And if they don't save the predators of rodents, reptiles, then they will have so many rodents that they will not have their plant. So people are realizing the risk. So either risk, or if they're extractive companies like mining, getting them to agree on offsetting their impact through these instruments. The idea of biodiversity instruments is that, of credits, is that you have a local equivalence. If I'm a company who has had X impact in a certain habitat of a certain areas impacting Y species, then I must invest in restoring another habitat in the same ecozone, ecosystem, in which I'm able to restore and create enough habitat to allow that species to regenerate. That's sort of the model. So there is the uptake that we are seeing on biodiversity credit instruments is faster than we expected. The second advantage that we have now is that, look, we've gone through 15 years of the carbon market cycle. So we have lessons on what goes right, what goes wrong, how numbers can be used and misused. So we are designing a standard to be foolproof in such a way. So that's one. So I think biodiversity nature credits, we all must watch out for. There are going to be new and new regulations. In my country, in India, we are working with the regulators. IAPB is also doing work in China, in Indonesia, in Brazil. The UK has a regulation now. So many, many countries are going to promulgate regulations on this, and this could be a huge market. Then there are a couple of highly well-known but unused instruments that people like us are now trying to mainstream in some of the habitats. The singular instrument that I want to highlight here is called bioprospecting. I don't think that we utilize the benefit of bioprospecting well enough. And now, again, with AI and machine learning, with the ability to genetically test material at speeds unknown in the past, there is a huge potential to get investments into conserving some of the last remaining really rich biodiverse landscapes in the world, just against licenses for genetic testing of material for future drug uses. This single instrument, if some of us can come together and really pioneer, it requires some investments upfront. It requires pushing regulators to have special norms. Under the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, there is already provisions of access benefit sharing which allow this. But this is a very interesting instrument that we are trying to pioneer. Then, of course, there is the whole idea of biodiversity-based tourism. Some companies and some countries have done very well. I think the appetite for that is going to increase a lot now. So I think that people who invest now in biodiverse nature-based tourism can make very healthy returns, because I think 15 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago, nature tourism was for hippies. Now it's for the wealthiest people in the world, right? Who want a reprieve from the world, they go to nature. So I think combining these business models, Soulaima, in landscapes which are biodiverse, first and foremost, we need to arrest the loss, because the loss is alarming. The rate of loss of biodiversity right now is higher than the rate of loss at the end of the dinosaurs era. And that's when an asteroid had hit us. Right now, nothing's hit us. So first is we need to institutionalize these models in those landscapes which are still remaining. Then we need to focus on regeneration, like I was saying. So there is a potential. There is one new upcoming instrument, and there are two existing instruments that we are trying to now popularize and drive investment towards, and which really can impact biodiversity.
My God, Swapan, you said you mentioned three things. You said bioprospecting. We need to dive into that a little bit more. We need to make sure that everyone understands this. And also bio-based tourism, or nature tourism, as you were saying, is a huge potential. Look at Greenland. Let's talk Greenland for a second. It's up in the media. Everyone wants to know whether Greenland is going to be American or not. So it's a little controversial. So why not use them as an example? I've been to Greenland. When I used to go to Greenland, there was not that many flights, not that many tourists, but now there are direct flights from US every day, multiple times a week, right? If not even more, I'm not sure. As a fellow Dane, I'm worried about tourism in Greenland. Of course, because more tourists makes an impact, right? But I also see what you're saying, that might be a benefit, because that you can create awareness. There's some financials that goes with it. I think Bhutan is a very good example how they kind of balanced nature tourism to that exact point where it didn't become too much and they attracted the right kind of tourists and so forth. But let's just go back to bioprospecting. Bioprospecting, what is that? I mean, you explained it, but why should we care? Like pharmaceutical companies, AI, I mean, a lot of us do believe that the algorithm itself will cure cancer and whatnot. Do we need nature for that?
So couple of things. One is that, Sulaiman, very quickly commenting on tourism. One of the things that we do when we identify a habitat for conservation is we do a natural capital assessment. A natural capital assessment actually is through some surveys, through some science, through some modeling, can give you an assessment of what's the natural capital worth in a landscape. So let's say if we were to do the natural capital assessment of Greenland using the right tools, we could tell that what is the true recreation potential of Greenland. Is it $1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion? And then you're right. Look, Bhutan was very smart about this, right? You know that Bhutan put this minimum floor that anybody who spends below this is not going to be allowed. They've never had more tourists because what the tourists got to know is that now there is quality tourism and etc. So I think that there are these models which not many have utilized, and I'm surprised why. But bioprospecting. So bioprospecting is actually the economic instrument is that you sell the rights to a company to prospect genetic material in an area with rich genetic material. Even though now you have machine learning models and algorithms, the algorithms at the moment are only able to look at, from what I understand, are able to look at whether certain genetic material will be able to control certain genetic flow of viruses, something like the source of all genetic material still comes from nature. Almost every drug synthesis is from nature, or many at least. There are some which are being chemically harvested, but still a lot of unknown drugs or unknown diseases for which cures are unknown. For that, still a lot of prospecting testing is being done on new genetic material which we don't even know exists, which comes from either a pristine rainforest, marine protected areas have so much biodiversity which we have not even tested and which we are killing even without knowing. This adds value. So the idea is that through an auction, through a Swiss auction, through some means, you realize the value. We've never realized this value anywhere. Right now, what happens is there is a lot of genetic piracy, or there is just direct acquisition of material by a company. But if we are able to assign a value through a fair mean system, we might see that there are certain companies who are willing to pay hundreds of millions to prospect the last remaining parts of the forest in Choco in Colombia, which is so rich in genetic material. That has to be then the place where all of this falls apart, is that if you do the right tourism or if you do right bioprospecting, you have to make sure that that surplus is invested in conservation. So that whole model has to come together.
I mean, one of the most protected banks that we have in the Nordics, you probably know this, and many of you listening in here might also know it, but one of the most protected and secret locations for the Nordic countries is actually all our seeds, Yeah, we have them hidden in mountains and underground and whatnot, locked up with very few people on earth knowing where those seeds are hidden, simply to make sure that if something happens to the earth, we will be able to go in and at least have one seed of this apple sword or corn sword or whatever. Seed banks is probably the right term for that. And it's very encouraging and very nice to know that that is happening. But there's also in the behind of your mind is also that little thought that, oh man, that might be a global disaster. That means that we could actually lose access to our food production and the fruits and vegetables and whatnot that we have been grown for hundreds or even thousands of years. But I was also thinking, Swapan, not many know about India, that India is actually in the very top when it comes to contributors and actually pragmatic strategies for protecting the environment. India is up there, but most people don't know. So what is the best kept secret about India when it comes to environment and sustainability?
Sure, but before that, because you brought this up, Sulema, I don't know if many of you saw this, but Svalbard, I think in Norway, is where the biggest seed bank of the world is, where seeds from around it's like Noah's Ark, where seeds from all over the world are kept, and the reason is because we don't practice genetic diversity in agriculture anymore. Most of the world does monocropping and commercial seeds, and if there is drastic climate change, it's sort of an argued fact that scientists might not be able to model fast enough to have new genetically modified seeds at the pace at which climate is changing. And in that seed bank, they preserve all varieties, not all, but many varieties of many seeds known to humanity, so that in future they can replicate them. But I think I was just looking up the exact date, I couldn't find, but 2 or 3 years ago, because the Arctic is melting, that seed bank, which was supposed to be permafrost, the ice melted and got flooded. So now even that seed bank is threatened by climate change. So we might lose that seed bank. Just FYI, everybody, we need to act faster on emissions. Hey, India, guys. So India, you all know, is a large country. We have 1.5 billion people, housed in roughly one third the size of China. So we have major challenges when it comes to managing our land, managing our natural resources. Having said that, India still arguably has done relatively well in terms of managing natural resources. We are one of the few large developing countries which still has close to about 24% of our land still under forest cover. We have the fastest growing number of protected areas for wildlife. We are home to some of the largest megafauna in the world: the tiger, the lion, the rhinoceros, the one-horned rhinoceros, the elephants, the bison, etc. And we have been able to maintain their habitats to the level that their numbers have actually increased in the last 20 years. We've conserved them well enough. India also was early on one of the countries which early on recognized the threat of climate change and set major targets to ourselves to actually work on climate change. So we have a ambitious NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution Target, which we've just updated. In our latest NDC, now we have a goal to increase. Earlier, I think our goal was to increase fossil fuel capacity to 50% by 2030, that half of our grid. Now we've increased it to 60% by 2035 because we are on our way. We've almost achieved 50%. So we will achieve it before 2030. Or we already have achieved 50%. Yeah, I think we achieved 50% just early this year. So now we're going to have 60%. So we've actually moved pretty fast. In terms of gross capacity of renewable energy, China is obviously even higher than us. In terms of average, like the percentage, we move pretty fast. We are one of the few countries which also has a major nature goal. We have a goal. Earlier goal was that we will enhance carbon sinks by 2.5 to 3 billion tons by 2030. And so we did the modeling for that for Government of India. We helped kind of develop a roadmap for the target. And we've already achieved 2 billion tons by 2026. So we've increased that to 3.5 to 4 billion tons by 2035. So that's creating a lot more forests and planting a lot more trees. So there is that. We also have some other interesting things that we've done. We have a green hydrogen mission to promote huge investments in hydrogen. We are, I think, one of the third or fourth large countries which has set up its own carbon trading scheme. So we have the carbon credit trading system. We also created a new market instrument called green credits, which is to allow for trading of environmental attributes of agriculture, water, forestry, to create sort of an interoperable, very large green market. And then we have huge focus on electric mobility, on circular economy, etc. So I think from a policy side, we do have a focus on this. I think finally, the reason why we are also able to save a lot of our nature is because it's cultural, because as part of India's ethos and values of all the major religions that exist here, Hinduism, Buddhism, even Islam, harmony with nature has been a core part of the early ethos of these religions. And I have seen this growing up myself. All of us in India, at least till a generation ago, this is something that we were actively taught, right? Like my grandmother always taught me to never waste water, never waste food, plant new trees, water plants, take care of animals, be kind to forests, etc. It's part of our culture as well. Having said that, we have challenges. We definitely have challenges. We have the largest cropped area in the world. I think it's 129 or 150 million hectares. I don't remember, but slightly higher than Brazil, which I was surprised when I read 5 years ago, because I always thought that given the population of India, how can we have so much area under agriculture? Our per hectare productivity of food is nearly half that of the US and Brazil. So that's a major challenge, which means that we are investing a lot in chemical agriculture. Our government has just launched a new sustainable agriculture mission, but it still continues to be a challenge. A lot of our land is degraded. Close to 90 million hectares of our land is degraded, mostly due to overuse of fertilizers. So that's a big challenge. Our population is still growing. China's population has stabilized, but ours is still growing, which means that there continues to be more pressure on our land, which means that even though we have these forests, many of them are degrading now because of removal of wood for energy, expansion of agriculture, etc., etc. So there are challenges that we have, and it's going to be very, very important that we are able to now plan the future of our growth as we industrialize a lot more in such a way that it's in harmony with nature, and many of us are working on that.
I almost feel like we could have a conversation itself just on AI and AI's impact on the globe when it comes to water consumption and the need for cooling and those sort of things. And data centers are the solution, but also the problem to a lot of things. So that's something that I'm very passionate about myself. But it's probably too specific for today's conversation. But we will have that on another one. But I'm also thinking about cooling. Right, everyone is feeling the heat nowadays. I was just reading that France and Italy and Greece and so forth are boiling, right? And a lot of people in France are, let's just say, take France as an example, because they don't have air condition as much as some other countries, but it's not necessarily something that Europe have tradition for. So people are being really, overheated, you could say. But cooling is an issue, right? I mean, we can plant a lot of trees and we can try to protect the forest by not rewarding those, cutting them down and so forth. But as the earth gets warmer and we need cooling and we use a lot of energy of AI centers, data centers, it's the magnitude of this problem, but also the solutions here. I'm curious, what could we do? And you said already that there are some market instruments that are available, and governments and private players and companies are already trying to do something very specific within their own companies or in their own countries. But what can we do as normal people? I can buy a piece of land, you said, in Brazil or even in India, and protect that. But what else can I do? I also have to breathe and exist, right? And a lot of cities are getting much warmer, and we don't have the solutions to tackle that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I just recently attended a conference in which some folks from Lawrence Berkeley presented this new publication where they have this trend across the world from North America to Europe, a large part of Europe to Asia, which they say that in 30 years is going to be unlivable because the temperatures, the wet bulb temperature will be more than 40 degrees, and wet bulb temperature 40 degrees means you can't exist there. So it is a very major challenge. So two things. One is that I think that I think about this very often, Soulaima, on both sides. One is that how can every citizen be part of the solution? Because a lot of agency, we have ourselves given a lot of agency to large corporations and governments now to act on our behalf, right? So I think we've progressively given up agency. If you look at historical means of governance, read Small is Beautiful, my favorite book by E.F. Schumacher. There was a time when we had decision-making capability on water use, on agriculture. We don't have that anymore. So how do we exercise agency? Is it even worth getting individuals to act versus governments to act is something I think about a lot. And I do believe it is. I think that firstly, we need to start exercising agency by making right choices in terms of the products that we consume so that we are giving a positive signal. Only those companies which are carbon neutral, biodiversity neutral, I think it's important. What's also happened in the last few years is there was a time when anybody who was carbon or biodiversity neutral automatically was priced double. I think that's not the case anymore. So consumers have an opportunity to consume smartly while being economical. I think that's critical. I also feel that we need to get climate, nature loss into political discourse, mainstream political discourse. Why is it that not enough politicians are competing for our vote on these agendas? I think so there's a lot that we can do on that. Now, the second part on how can we as individuals cope with the impacts that are already there, because some of this stuff is unfortunately already there. The Atlantic current, they say, is already unwinding. We'll have the biggest El Nino ever this year, so there might be food production issues. Temperatures are rising, and it's very difficult. So this whole idea of climate adaptation and climate risk reduction is a very, very fast emerging field. There's a lot of science here. Unfortunately, if you live in a area which is highly vulnerable, is highly impacted, you are dependent on the system. There are still some measures that you can take very, very locally. Like you can look at traditional methods of cooling using nature-based solutions. You can make sure that your city has enough of a forest that it creates a microclimate to attract rain before other areas do, and there is respite. It's been proven that if you pick the right species and plant it at the right angle in your city, your avenues can be 5 to 6 degrees cooler than without the trees. So there are some solutions, but you need to do it properly. You need to do it at a meta CV level, not just your house. And then finally, you will need to lobby with your local politicians to put in place those adaptation measures, right? You will need, as an example, now in India, in some cities, the temperatures go to 50 degrees. Some of us have been advocating with the Indian government now to make cooling a necessary right, because at 50 degrees, people start to die, Soulaima. But then the whole question of how do you get the investment? How do you get the energy? So you see, we've put ourselves in a problem to solve which we'll have to just increase the problem. So that's what I can say there, that There are some passive cooling and passive solutions exist. We need to research them. We need to get our local leaders to invest in them. And yes, we need to advocate for reduction of our impact so that overall we solve this problem.
And, to be quite honest, also talking about climate refugees, right? I mean, we think that we have seen refugees now, but honestly speaking, we will see many more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
And climate conflicts, Soulaima, around the world for water, etc. So yeah, unfortunately, unless we act really fast.
Yeah, absolutely. We still have a little bit of time, and but I'm mindful that it's getting late in India. I've seen how positive you always are. You're always smiling. You always have a lot of gratitude and dignity, and you seem always so positive. But to be quite honest, how do you stay this optimistic, and how do you not get angry? I think that's my question with what's happening.
Yeah. I've progressively stopped getting angry because I realized that, firstly, I fundamentally have faith in humanity. And, my faith is also based on my observation. If you see around you now, the younger generation, the 16-year-olds today, I believe that they're going through a global collective conscious awakening, right? You see that they believe in minimalism. They're asking the right questions about environment and nature. They're asking for accountability from their parents, from leaders, etc. So I do believe that there is something happening in the world, and I have huge faith and huge optimism based on this youngest generation. For whatever reason, maybe they are the first generation to grow up in prosperity, whatever. But I feel that and because they are so connected to each other because of the internet today, I believe that they're inspiring each other. And I see when I meet youngsters in Delhi or in Paris or in San Francisco, all my friends' children, it's amazing to see that almost all of them believe that they need to be more responsible and consume lesser. So that inspires me. I also believe that humanity, unfortunately, we only react when we are very close to disaster. But when we do react, we are able to find solutions to some of the biggest problems. Right? We were about to die of hunger in the 80s, we solved it. We were about to die from economic depression, we solved it. So I'm hoping that we also fundamentally as a species realize that we are really not good to nature and we solve it. It's not happening as fast as I would like to, and that does frustrate me. But I realize that I need to keep going, and I also need to focus on the solutions. The problem we all know, but how can we find the solutions? Because I feel that once few of us really identify this holy grail of positive, investable, large-scale nature solutions, the rest will support us. I think that's what keeps me going.
Swapan, thank you so much for being the CEO of Laura Ecological Solutions and for everything you're doing out of India, traveling the world and doing all the good things that you are doing. Thank you for that. You've been working tirelessly on this for a decade or more. I like to ask for a call to action. How do we stay engaged with your work? Ecological Solutions have many projects ongoing, but how can we help? How can we support? And how can we make sure that you get that little extra push that can make you successful in achievements of these many good projects that you're working on and putting nature front and center before it's too late, honestly?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this, Soulaima, and because many of us here and many of us who hopefully will listen to this webinar are very accomplished in a diverse range of careers such as finance, manufacturing, IT, tech, AI. I would love for us to align on a centralized, agreed call for action on nature. So here's what I'm going to do. There is a portal that we've just developed called bankingonnature.org. I would urge all of you to go there, and I'll send the URL exact URL out to Soulaima and to all of you. And I'm going to post there sort of a call to action. There is a very easy to understand bankingonnature.com, .org, bankingonnature.com. We have posted there basic trainings and learnings on why invest in nature, how technology can help you invest in nature today. And at the end, I'm going to upload by Monday a declaration that I would love for you to sign in terms of how you will act on nature in your lives and how we can work together to really further this cause. So that'll be what I can do.
I mean, what more can I ask for, and how much more can we wish for? Thank you, Swapan, for tuning in live from India and sharing with us a lot of optimistic, very specific and very concrete things that you're working on to help us survive and not having to move to outer space with Elon Musk. So we really appreciate that a lot. Well,
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone, live today. And remember, if you are a member of the YDL community, you can ask questions in our chat groups. And if you're just tuning in, curious to learn more about the Saturday Salon, it's every Saturday at this very time, 8:30 a.m. Pacific time. And if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out. But thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you, Swapan, for tuning in live here from us today.
Thank you, Soulaima, for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here.